Hi, I'm Patrick Braga. I'm at Cornell University, and I have essentially two goals today, which is to identify key shortcomings in Brazilian land use planning, specifically in Rio de Janeiro, and to provide some information that can maybe inform any new urbanist ventures in the country. So among the main challenges that Brazilian cities tend to face are high-rise sprawl, despite some great examples of walkable neighborhoods, and regulations that don't prescribe great walkable streets, even though they're certainly possible within. But alternatives and precedents certainly exist for walkability within Brazilian cities. So in the past few years within new urbanist circles, there's been a lot of concern for Chinese urbanism and the high-rise sprawl that's associated with Chinese cities. So there's centricity on automobiles in an environment where spaced-out buildings are high-rise towers rather than single-family homes. But few people are really talking about high-rise sprawl in the case of Brazil, and I want to bring this geography more into the new urbanist discourse. So these photos were taken from a residential tower in Barra da Tijuca, which is a high-end beachfront residential borough of Rio de Janeiro, and it really exemplifies the archetypal ideal of the tower in the park, which is an idea from Le Corbusier that was imported to Brazil by means of Oscar Niemeyer and Lúcio Costa, who designed both the master plan for this borough as well as the car-reliant capital city of Brasilia. And this photo illustrates a typical street frontage in the residential areas of Baja. And indeed, if you took the high-rise towers and erased them from the picture, you could think, oh, maybe we're in Florida or California, which has low-rise sprawl that we're so familiar with. And though the landscaping initially makes this form of urbanism visually attractive, these settlement patterns severely limit opportunities for economic development on this land. This is a resulting landscape that's generated when several buildings are built according to this model in close proximity, and it's not too different from landscapes we might see in other developing countries like China or India. And unfortunately, this kind of design thinking has even been exported to older parts of the city. But thankfully, Brazilian cities like Rio still have a broad palette of successful walkable neighborhoods that we can look at, such as Rio's historic downtown, which also, unfortunately, is not immune to incursions from high-rise sprawl. In fact, I think this image from the downtown best captures the kinds of limitations that high-rise sprawl can impose on a place. So the old buildings here on the street front open directly onto the street. They can house a variety of commercial uses and immediately fit the idea of the Jane Jacobs eye on the street model. You can sense that immediately humans might be behind there, even though I took this photo during a national holiday, which is why the businesses were closed. The newer building, on the other hand, has a glass wall along the sidewalk. It creates no destinations. There's no reason for anybody necessarily to be walking on that stretch of sidewalk except to pass the building. That building doesn't create a destination of itself. In fact, there's a parking garage entrance that opens onto just around the corner. But thankfully, Rio de Janeiro's rich architectural heritage, especially from when it used to be the capital of Brazil through the 1950s, gives us some really great examples of high-quality mid-rise and high-rise buildings, especially in mid-century modern and Art Deco styles, which proliferate throughout the city. And these can still generate active street fronts. If you look behind the construction of the city's new streetcar line, this photo is from October 2015, you get a sense of how those 1930s, 1940s high-rises produced that. And many of the buildings in the beachside borough of Copacabana, which is famous for the beaches, and you may, nearby Ipanema, you may have heard the song Girl from Ipanema, these buildings also have lively street frontages. Ironically, the zoning for this area is blanketed as residential for the entire borough, but as I'll show, there's a reason why even in residential districts you can get streets that are very commercial in character, which brings up a recurring theme in Brazilian zoning, that good street frontages are certainly possible, but the way that the regulations are written today make it so that we can never be actually certain that they'll necessarily happen. And again, I'm limiting myself to regulated neighborhoods, so not informal settlements. But traditional neighborhoods in cities like Rio, though, still offer really wonderful patterns of building setbacks and relationships with the streets that we can continue to imitate in newer buildings, even if we're not imitating them in terms of architectural style. And they also offer inspiration for missing middle housing typologies that we can try to bring back. So small multifamily residential types like these townhouses are almost non-existent in contemporary residential development, either in Rio or elsewhere in Brazil. So the way that the regulations are written today, many amazing environments like this are either a thing of the past or a product of happy accident. So how can we prevent dead street frontages like this with blank walls that really typify so much of the city nowadays? The challenge really extends to newer districts. So in this plan for a massive new urban neighborhood nearby Baja, this area is called Vargens, and right now it's essentially semi-rural land, some low-density, higher-end residential. and it's still within the city limits of Rio de Janeiro, we see indication that municipal planners are finally beginning in a really comprehensive and meaningful way within Rio to connect transportation to land use. But unfortunately, the zoning is downright Euclidean. It's very much this type is residential, this type commercial, and the urban design is very much essentially Le Corbusier all over again. And it's auto-oriented. But where have existing regulations worked is what I wanted to find out. So this is the Orleans Plaza in the borough of Taquara. And in 2012, the city government designated the streets around this plaza a culinary pole, both polo gastronômico in Portuguese. So the city recognized the success of food businesses in the area and sought to encourage their development, but the designation only includes two tangible urban planning strategies. First is, quote, free traffic flow of vehicles and pedestrians, which the government did a bit of by preventing sidewalk parking and building raised crosswalks, and second, installing signage identifying the neighborhood as a dining destination. But the law today, and this is just an excerpt that I translated, the law today does little to protect what actually makes these streets so great, which are active, permeable street frontages that engender lively public spaces. Notice, for instance, in the regulations that buildings detached from lot boundaries can have a higher number of stories than buildings that go to the side. On the one hand, so that's a good thing that we're measuring them in terms of stories rather than just meters, for instance. That's typical of modern form-based codes. But it can also create mini tower in the park type of environments along a street front. And often these requirements have formal implications even if they're not explicit. So if you look at 3B about non-residential land uses, that has, let's see, oh yes, so non-residential land uses can only have independent access from other uses. That has implications, say, for the design of live-work units. Or if we look at 2D, that allows 30% of a lot area to be commercial, that forces mixed use in an actually really interesting way because it requires that there be residential on the lot if you're putting commercial in this type of zone. But narrow buildings like the ones that I showed in downtown are essentially illegal. So one historic sobrado, or urban multi-story house, is about 4 meters or 12 feet wide, but the regulations require, 9 meters? Yeah, 9 meters, so almost 30 feet of width along the street front. And so I modeled 3 scenarios of what could happen to that street frontage on that picture that I showed you under current zoning regulations. So the top is the urban fabric today. The middle is what would happen if a developer essentially bought 2 parcels at a time and built up as much as they could. And the bottom is the absolutely disastrous result of what could be built if a developer managed to get a hold of all the land on that block. The middle one has the potential to be acceptable if the developers actively choose to include ground floor commercial uses. But again, that's not a guarantee. And that has to be a deliberate choice from the part of the developer. So the code does not guarantee that this street will remain commercial, despite the city government trying to encourage activity there. So what kinds of regulatory directions can we take in cities like Rio and other Brazilian cities to make walkable and engaging streets a guarantee rather than a happy accident? Form-based coding offers some good techniques, but it has to go beyond building form standards and indeed encompass the kind of visioning process that we've grown accustomed to with form-based coding in the United States. Now, there is some precedent for form-based zoning in Brazil, dating all the way back to an imperial decree. Yes, Brazil used to be an empire from 1811 that essentially, as they say in the CNU small developer sessions, form follows finance. So here you got a tax break for generating specific built forms. And even if we look at the original map of the Orleans Plaza, so that commercial culinary district that I showed, even though it's quite faded, here at the bottom we see some indications for graphic development regulations giving ideas of how the people who platted this neighborhood wanted to see residential and commercial setbacks from the street. And as another illustration of these happy accidents that happen in Brazilian neighborhoods, all those commercial streets along the plaza were actually originally intended to be residential. And larger lots that were supposed to be commercial wound up being residential ones. And other contemporary maps from the 1930s are really remarkably relevant in providing examples for how we can generate these older patterns of street frontages again, such as by limiting the height of garden walls so that we don't get these hallways of blank walls throughout the city. This 1930s neighborhood is actually almost intact today, and the map suggests almost a quality of a regulating plan with form-based coding. But unfortunately, the regulations nowadays didn't prevent a great historic neighborhood like this from being maimed by large setbacks and large blank walls and the demolition of one of the original buildings. Indeed, one of the remarkable aspects of Rio de Janeiro's urban history is that every legally approved change to the physical city that was approved by the city government from 1902 onward is documented and freely available from the city government on these online maps. And one of the great features of these maps, again, are these graphic regulations. So on the top, for instance, you see if you have the challenge of a narrow street, for example, one solution for arborization on that street is, rather than expecting trees on the public right-of-way, is to expect them in shallow front yard setbacks. And notice also as well there's an illustration limiting garden walls to just essentially waist height rather than 1.5 humans. And this is another example of that. And Brazil is in a happy position to have these kinds of precedents for form-based zoning or zoning based on built form, so that form-based zoning for new projects doesn't necessarily feel like an international import. And like we've been saying, there are plenty of notable Latin American examples. So in short, by focusing on how buildings meet the street and generate lively public sidewalks and public spaces, form-based coding can offer a solution to undo the deadening effects of isolated towers and the effects of high-rise sprawl in newer neighborhoods, as well as their deadly forays into the wonderful older neighborhoods of Brazilian cities. Thank you.